Well, welcome to the show. Thanks for joining us. Today, our first story, we go to Israel, where there's yet another stalemate in the election. The final votes have been counted, and once again, no clear winner.
So who holds the keys to Israel's future? And why are some saying the Jewish state needs a miracle to free it from political gridlock? Chris Mitchell has the story from Jerusalem.
The results of Israel's fourth election within 2 years look like the last three, with no clear winner. The parties aligned with Prime Minister Netanyahu total 52 seats. The parties committed against Netanyahu total 57 seats. Two parties are uncommitted. The right-wing party Yamina holds 7 seats. Ra'am, or the United Arab List, an Islamist party, has 4 seats. With those 4 seats, Ra'am may hold the key to who gets the 61 seats needed to form a coalition. Its leader, Mansour Abbas, wants any government in power to provide more support to Israeli Arabs. Making the path toward forming a new government even more complicated, some parties refuse to sit in a coalition with other parties. Once again, it puts Israel's politics in disarray.
Israel is experiencing its worst political crisis in decades. It's apparent that our political system finds it very difficult to produce a decisive outcome. This is as a result of inherent weaknesses in our electoral system, but it's also because of the Netanyahu factor. A very popular prime minister that wants to remain in power, although he was indicted, and Israelis are split right down the middle on this question.
Now parties are scrambling for support and defectors from other parties. Israel will begin the celebration of the Passover on Saturday evening. Some say Israel will need another miracle to deliver it from its political plight.
Well, Chris Mitchell is joining us now from Jerusalem. So, Chris, tell us about the Ra'am Party. Who are they? What are their goals?
Well, right now they made news just a few weeks ago, Gordon, by saying that they would be willing to work with Netanyahu. And actually, Netanyahu reached out to the Arab population this election, unlike the other 3 elections. It may surprise people that Ra'am is a chapter of the Muslim Brotherhood. They're nationalistic. What do I mean by that? They want an Islamic state in Palestine. That's why some parties will not sit in a government with Ra'am. For example, the Religious Zionist Party won't sit with them. They're on the other end of the spectrum, both politically and religiously. A number of parties are unwilling to sit with each other. For example, Gideon Sa'ar won't sit with the Joint List. That's another Arab party. The Joint Arab List won't sit with some of the extreme right parties. Another party, Yamina, where we mentioned in the report, won't sit with Meretz, a far-left party. And that's what makes this post-election scenario so complicated. Some people describe it sort of like a political Rubik's Cube.
Well, what are the chances that Netanyahu continues as prime minister, or is someone else emerging as a leader that people can coalesce behind?
Well, right now it looks very difficult for Netanyahu to survive, but he's a survivor. He's been the longest-serving prime minister in Israel's history. He's trying to convince some of these extreme right parties to be able to sit with Ra'am, even outside the government. And what I mean by that, you can have a minority government, meaning you have less than 61 seats, but you have parties that won't vote against you, and that's the way that could happen. He's trying to get defectors from some of the right parties that are against him to join him and defect from, say, New Hope, come to his Likud party. But in terms of prime minister, Gordon, there's really 4 possibilities. You have Benjamin Netanyahu, Naftali Bennett, Benny Gantz, and Yair Lapid. And either of one of those really does have a possible shot at being prime minister. So right now, lots of horse trading going on. They may try to form a government and actually pass a law outlawing any prime minister serving who's under indictment. Certainly that's directed exactly against Prime Minister Netanyahu. There's also the possibility of a 1-year government just in order to pass a budget. Israel's the only Western country without a 2020 budget. They don't have a 2021 budget, and we're looking at a 2022 budget, and that's really hurting Israel right now, being able to just function as a government.
Well, I don't have much hope for the Muslim Brotherhood sitting down with any of the Orthodox parties. So are we going to see a 5th election later this year?
It could happen. And if you talk to Israelis, a lot of them just seem fatalistic. Well, we're going to go to a fifth elections. It really does depend on a number of different factors, and so many various scenarios could unfold. What kind of coalition can be formed? It really depends on who's going to be recommending to the president within probably after Passover, which starts on Saturday evening, who will be the next prime minister. And they have Shabbat coming up today, Passover starting tomorrow night. So right now I've been hearing some people in these campaigns are going to be turning off their phones and they'll be praying.
Well, I've got to ask this. What does this mean for Israel's security? There's a lot going on right now with international diplomacy, the Abraham Accords, trying to create a joint security deal, even with Saudi Arabia. So how can they find any direction going forward with this kind of confusion in the election?
Yeah, great question, Gordon. I think internally there's lots of confusion going on. I think in terms of sort of the main threat facing Israel right now with Iran, I think almost everybody on the political spectrum is united on that. So I think the IDF will still be watching any threats coming against the Jewish state. On the other hand, with diplomacy and foreign policy, a number of countries, particularly the U.S., is going to be wondering, who can I talk to? Right now, there'll be a caretaker government with Benjamin Netanyahu still as prime minister. But certainly the internal confusion and disarray is really affecting its standing diplomatically around the world. But that's certainly the reason people should be praying for the peace of Jerusalem right now.
Well, Chris, thanks for the insight. And I'll echo that. Pray for the peace of Jerusalem. Pray for the peace of Israel. In other news, President Biden held his first press conference yesterday after more than 2 months in office. And John Jessup has that story from our CBN News Bureau in Washington. John?
That is right, Gordon. The news conference came later in the Oval Office term than any other president in modern history. And Mr. Biden made his case on a wide variety of issues. CBN White House correspondent Eric Phillips brings us this look at what the president had to say.
We're told the president had been preparing for this press conference all week long, and while there were some questionable moments, it certainly was not a disaster. He started off touting the American Rescue Plan and vaccine successes, even increasing his original goal of 100 million shots in his first 100 days in office to 200 million. But immigration was clearly what was on the minds of reporters, especially the influx of unaccompanied minors.
The idea that I'm going to say, which I would never do, if an unaccompanied child ends up at the border, we're just going to let him starve to death and stay on the other side. No previous administration did that either, except Trump.
Although administration officials have reported that the crossings at the southwest border are on pace for the highest levels in 20 years, the president said the problems at the border are not new, and migrants aren't coming in droves just because they think he's such a nice guy.
The reason they're coming is that it's the time they can travel with the least likelihood of dying on the way because of the heat in the desert, number one. Number two, they're coming because of the circumstances in country.
He says 5,000 more beds have been made available at the border at Fort Bliss, and that the U.S. would be better prepared to deal with the situation there if it had not been for the previous administration.
What he did, he dismantled all the elements that exist to deal with what had been a problem and has been continued to be a problem for a long time. He, in fact, shut down the number of beds available.
On the practice known as the filibuster in the Senate, the president said he's for reforming it, but not necessarily abolishing it.
It's being abused in a gigantic way.
If not, why not abolish it if it's a relic of the Jim Crow era?
Successful electoral politics is the art of the possible.
Asked about the bills in progress in states across the country that Democrats say would restrict voting, the president called it a gigantic problem.
This makes Jim Crow look like Jim Eagle. The Republican voters I know find this despicable.
On China, the president says the U.S. should be in competition with the country and not in confrontation with it. And he says the U.S. has to step up its game.
But they have an overall goal to become the leading country in the world, the wealthiest country in the world, and the most powerful country in the world. That's not going to happen on my watch.
And what about the political future of the president?
No, an answer is yes. My plan is to run for re-election. That's my expectation.
Interesting that the president would give that response about running again when just Wednesday, the White House rebranded the Biden administration as the Biden-Harris administration, seeming to raise the profile of the vice president. In Washington, Eric Phillips, CBN News.
And Republicans argue that Biden's own rhetoric led to more migrants coming to the border and that both he and former President Barack Obama defended the filibuster when they were both in the Senate. Well, the big tech CEOs of Facebook, Twitter, and Google were under fire again on Capitol Hill Thursday, taking heat from both sides of the aisle. Democrats are unhappy with the social media giants for allowing misinformation about COVID-19 and other problems and helping people prepare for the January 6th Capitol attack in Washington, while Republicans are still criticizing them for censoring conservative points of view.
We're all aware of big tech's ever-increasing censorship of conservative voices and their commitment to serve the radical progressive agenda by influencing a generation of children and removing, shutting down, or canceling any news, books, and even now toys that aren't considered woke. This is fundamentally un-American.
Mr. Zuckerberg, Mr. Puchai, and Mr. Dorsey, you failed to meaningfully change after your platforms played a role in fomenting insurrection, in abetting the spread of the virus, and trampling American civil liberties. Your business model itself has become the problem, and the time for self-regulation is over. It's time we legislate to hold you accountable. That's what we're going to do.
Congress has held several hearings on the matter so far, Gordon, but so far Congress has yet to act.
Well, they need to act, and they need to recognize that these big tech companies have essentially become utilities, that just as the electric utilities and our water utilities and our trash and all of this are all regulated, they need regulation. And one of the easiest things to do is extend constitutional protections of freedom of speech to these tech platforms. There's already an established case law. You're not making up anything new. You're just saying that these protections of freedom of speech extend through the internet, through these major platforms. And if you do that, I think you solve the problem.